And welcome back. Last video you saw we had zero compression in the number 7 cylinder, and yes, in case you haven't already noticed, I did remove the brake booster. Unfortunately, I tried to separate the master cylinder from the brake booster to avoid from having to re-bleed the brakes, but they didn't give you enough slack in those lines, those hard lines, unfortunately, to be able to just separate the master cylinder from the booster. But you can see how big that booster is. It was just playing way too much grief trying to get this valve cover off and trying to get in here and work, so I removed it. I'm sure there's probably a procedure to not have to do this, but trying to get that valve cover off, unlike the 6.4, the oil filling neck gets in your way, so you hit it, and then you end up hitting the oil dipstick tube, and then you'll end up hitting the air conditioning lines. So it was just easier in my case to undo those 4 bolts and just pull the brake booster and master cylinder out of here, and that cover was easy to remove at that point. But well, we found something interesting. Anybody know what this is? A push rod. Intake side of number 7. This was no longer connected to the bar that goes across, that all the push rods nest into, and then those in turn actuate the springs. So that would be one reason for not having compression. You can't make compression if you can't open the intake valve to pull air in. And I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but you can turn this ever so slightly, and you can see that it is slightly bent. Now that maybe that's what caused it to pop out of its holder to begin with, or maybe whoever assembled this engine last didn't make sure that all the push rods were properly seated before torquing down that rocker arm. Because you can get into a situation where these just barely sit inside the cups on the rocker arm, and it'll look good until you go to start it, or until a little bit while later, and this will pop out of the cup on the rocker arm and just sit there and kind of lay. And that's what this one was. This one was literally just laying inside of its bore doing nothing. So that's the good thing is it's not a broken spring. Bad thing is it is a push rod, so hopefully that just popped out. I'll have to see if the push rods I took out of the 6.4 for the intake are the same part number. It may be, because when I researched the valve springs for this one, the valve springs for the 5.7 were the exact same as the factory 6.4 springs that we took out when we did the cam and lifter upgrade in that truck there. And if you remember, when we did the upgrade there, we replaced it with hardened push rods. So I have a bunch of these older push rods that came out of that one. Now ideally you want these to be put back in the same pairing as the lifter, because they do wear together. But unfortunately, with this being bent, I really do not want to tear that head apart just to get to the lifters and replace the lifters on that side. Now, depending on what else we find once we get this up and running, we may have to pull the heads off and do cam and lifters regardless. But so far, that's what it is. Cylinder number 7, intake push rod, not attached to the rocker arm, therefore not actuating the intake valve. So the valve that was partially open inside of the video clip that I took looks like it was the exhaust valve. So that one, should be open and obviously closed. I don't see an issue. I don't see where that spring is sunken down any. In other words, I don't see evidence of a valve spring being broke. Unfortunately, it's got these lovely metal shields around the spring, so you can't quite see all of it. But once we get a push rod back in there and get it torqued back down, we'll rotate the engine over by hand a little bit and just verify that we see both the intake and exhaust valves actuate before we put the cover back on. Now, the passenger side one, I'm probably going to take it off as well to make sure that we don't have a potential issue there with the number 4 having still slightly lower compression than everything else. So since we're here and we got the driver's one pulled off, it's actually a bit easier to get the passenger one pulled off. So we'll go ahead and do that just to do a cursory inspection. And then yeah, you can actually probably see it's a little bit warped better right there. Let me try that in there. Yeah, it's you can kind of just barely see it, but it does have a little bit of a bend to it. I'll bring you back if I find anything inside of that passenger head. I'll probably make a separate video out of it, but I want to go ahead and get this one posted as a relatively short video, just to let everybody know that right now it doesn't look like it was a broken valve spring, just a popped out push rod. So I'm gonna look and see if I got a potential replacement for this, and then we'll get it installed, and you know, hopefully in the next video too we'll attempt to get another start. Yes, and I do know that pulling that brake master cylinder off means we're gonna have to bleed the entire brake system. Yeah, I know, oh joy. But what I'm gonna do for now is, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and leave it laying out. I'm going to just go ahead and put this guy in a safe spot, and then I'll bring you back for the next one. But talk to you later. Bye. Well, I had enough hours, or we had enough hours left in daylight here, so I didn't want to leave you hanging. I haven't disturbed it yet. That's the number 4 cylinder. Hopefully you can see it. Get a flashlight on it. What's that? Right there. Hopefully you can hear it. That's once again the intake valve. Push rods popped out of the, I keep forgetting the name of that part, and I keep remembering that part, but basically pushed out of the not valve guide, not valve rail, whatever. I keep forgetting the name of that thing. But the more interesting factor here is, how was this cylinder building pressure, albeit lower pressure than the rest of the cylinders, if it wasn't actuating the intake valve to pull air in to build pressure with? The only thing I could think of is that since this is close enough, the push rod may have been falling in as the cam went in and grabbing the very lip of the arm enough to push the valve down to get a little bit into the cylinder and then thus build pressure, is the only thing I could think of. Because it did act a bit weird when it built pressure, and I didn't say this on the other video, but I went back and tried it with a couple of test gauges. But what would happen is, like I said, you'd see about 140 pounds in this cylinder, and occasionally you'd only see about 53 pounds in this cylinder, so much less. So the only thing I could think that would account for that is that push rod was occasionally going down enough and just catching the actuator arm here enough to push it down to at least build some amount of pressure. But that's definitely the issue. And let's get this guy pulled out of here. Oh yeah, look at the bend in that bad boy. That's not something you will necessarily want to see. Woo, that's almost a 45-degree bend. But that would explain why it popped out of the holder. The slight bend in the other push rod would explain why that one probably popped out of its holder. But most importantly, good thing is we took the valve cover off of this side and noticed that bit of additional damage. So what are the odds that not one, but 2 cylinders, both on the intake side, had push rods that popped out of their holders? This is just weird. Okay, yep. Everything else feels like it's seated like it's supposed to be. Like I said, the only thing I could think of is that somebody was in here dinking with this engine, doing upgrades, doing whatever, and when they put this rail back in, they didn't make sure that these push rods were seated in place, because it'll behave that way. It'll just barely sit on the edge, and either they'll fall out right away and you'll get an immediate misfire when you put everything back together, or they can perchance fall out over time and then you'll end up with a misfire. But yeah, this engine definitely wasn't going to go anywhere with 2 cylinders like that. Now, for the more depressing news, if you know your engines and you know your water, you'll know what that looks like. And that is over here on the passenger side, but it's only in a couple of spots of the cylinder head. Like, you can see some accumulation of gunk there, kind of on the spots here, and just kind of on the corners. Now, it's not all over the cylinder head, which is kind of curious as to, because, you know, obviously there should never be water on the inside of this valve cover mixing with the water, mixing with the oil in any circumstances. So the question is, do we by chance have a bad seal here for our spark plug wells, and maybe some water intrusion was getting into this area here? Worst case scenario, and we haven't done it yet, but worst case is we drain the oil out of the truck and we find antifreeze in the oil. And if that's the case, that means we potentially have a bad head gasket. And if we have a bad head gasket, then that could potentially mean warped heads. Yeah, obviously you do the math. Now, when we scoped the cylinders, I didn't see evidence of coolant in any of the cylinders. So that's a good thing. And we'd been running the truck, and there's no evidence of at least the exhaust it was producing. There was no telltale evidence of like the stereotypical white smoke you would see if it was actually burning coolant and had a head gasket problem. So hopefully this is just an anomaly. You know, we'll get this cleaned up, but what we need to do is source a second intake push rod. Again, if the part number is the same for the old factory ones we took out of the 6.4 up the hill, we'll just swap 2 of those in for now. And if we can prove the engine's a runner and we can prove it's stable and in good condition, then we'll look at replacing, you know, valve cover seals, because these are getting pretty hard and brittle, and you're supposed to replace them anytime you pull the valve covers out. But I don't want to do that until we know the motor's in good shape. If we can at least get it running well enough to get it out of the street and into the driveway, we'll do that. But if the motor seems to be too far gone to save at this point, then we'll pull it and we'll replace it with the one that's in the red one up the hill. But right now the goal is see if we can get it running, see if it's salvageable. If not, can we get it running well enough to at least get it out of the street, because it's starting to get summer, starting to get hot. Okay, and so with that being said, we're just going to put the valve covers in place just to keep any debris out of the cylinder heads, and then I'm going to source some parts, and then we'll bring you back for the next one. But yeah, that's the culprit for both cylinders that were 0 or low on compression. Both of them, push rods were popped out of the valve rail on the intake side. And so with that being said, I'll talk to you later. Bye.